Welcome, wargamers, into a glimpse of an Armageddon averted and one being walked into. My name is Doug with 2+ Stuff, and today we are exploring the background or lore of Marcher, Empires at War, a stunning miniatures game produced by the team at Golden Dragon Games, who have designed an incredible range of alternate history miniatures for use in wargaming. And from these designs, a world was inspired and crafted for them to live in. This video will cover just such a story. Now, to make sure the details weren't lost in the sauce of delivery here, Marcher is an alternate history wargame. A lot of the major powers are recognizable from our world, so the USA, French, Russian armies, for example. But this is a world where the most important 150 years or so of civilizational development turned out very, very differently. And the outcome, in this setting at least, is a spike of technological advancement, but at the same time, aesthetically and culturally, we were still gearing up for something resembling World War II. So I guess to oversimplify it, you could say it's a steampunk or dieselpunk World War II game, but the players on this stage are a little bit different. Now, it's always kind of difficult to start with alternate timelines, right? Because when does the point of distinction happen? But I think it's best if we lay down some core ideas first. The setting radically began to diverge from our own right around the year 1700. The writers over at Marcher left some wiggle room, but that's roughly the time period when things change. So we have a ton of the same, religious, geographical, and historical memories up until that point, which of course accounts for most of human history, right? But really the core idea behind the world of Marcher is that mankind entered the industrial age much, much earlier. And some key inventions in our world came out sooner and out of order than how we did it in our timeline. Things like the proliferation of electricity. The light bulb came about 100 years before in Marcher's time. Railroads to connect the countries were laid down sooner. The invention of the modern battery, same thing, very fast. And of course, while those things existed in our World War II universe, this is a bit like a historical estuary where those events are jammed into the World War I era timeline. The pace of change of the events that led to our World War I is much greater in Marcher's universe. Very disruptive, and that's part of why we got into that war in the first place. So the idea of technologies but combined with pre-World War I empires is kind of a thing. Now that in itself is a massive change, right? It's overarching to the entire setting. The technological revolution came faster, and it came at a time when the world was still run by leaders who called them things like czars. Czar means Caesar. So this world with its increased timeline, but changing from an even older world than we were in our World War II. And it begins to make this setting feel anachronistic, which is wonderful for a wargaming army. Right? This is when you get for king and country, and they're all out there with Gauss weapons and stuff like that, where the technology has gone so much further beyond the people wielding it. So because they didn't have a World War I, where a lot of those empires were toppled or reorganized or whatever, it's that world moving into the next. So with that core idea detailed, right, how did this change the world as we understand it? And the simplest way to chat about this is, the changes to civilizational development and that kind of thing, is to just show it to you place by place. Now, I want to add here that if you go over to World Anvil, the writers of Marcher have been killing it. There is a massive and detailed history going over how these nations, evolved differently from our timeline and were set up to reach the magnitudes that they did. I plan to do more lore videos kind of going into the more specifics of each nation or power that exists in this game. This is much more of a 4-foot dive, don't head first, we're just going to brush over the broad details for you. Now, looking at the map from a zoomed out view, a few very important things jump off the page at you, even before we go continent to continent. Basically, with the Industrial Revolution happening so early, and being spread so much more widely, the development of slave states and practices and full industries of trade never developed. Machines just took that industry from them. Nations were able to develop very differently. But the immense cost of this technology basically drives a lot of these nations to unify with one another. Sure, the US and Russia and Germany were all big powers in World War II. They could afford the arms race to develop new weapon systems, but smaller nations couldn't. The industry just wasn't there, and so they began to join together to form power blocks. This means that there are fewer mega powers on the planet, right? It's a multipolar world in terms of the axes that everyone has to rest on in terms of government power and money. Fewer nation states, but they are made out of independent nations who banded together for self-preservation, as a way to invest in themselves at a greater level. So going from like left to right, we see up in Canada is the new French Republic, which of course owes its local lineage to the original French-Canadian settlers. Makes a lot of sense. The US is largely the same, but it has expanded south down to include Mexico. And this was done for a few reasons. One was to use industrial labor and the raw natural resources that exist in Mexico, but also to secure the Gulf and to limit the ground border to that land chain that brings it to South America. There's a whole thing on how Mexico got brought into the US, which we'll cover when we do the USA dedicated lore video. But heading down south, we see these largely recognizable nations in name, but again, these represent the confederation of many smaller countries. This map does not exposit on their individual government style. For example, this could be something akin to like the EU, where there are individual countries within, but they function together as one. Europe becomes highly interesting at this point because this is where a lot of those historical events from this time period went down in our time, World War I and II. So how did things shake up here? Well, one thing you can tell just by looking over the entire map is that the British have been busy, right? Their colonies have really expanded, solidified, and now fortified. They are functioning members of the British Empire, and again, work towards a single goal. The new French Republic is much the same. The borders of France itself is a little bit different, but their holdings in Canada, Africa, have come together to make a massive set of assets to the whole nation. And this works because they had the technology. They were able to bring the food, the resources, whatever it took to make the world a better place. And that's one thing I want to kind of point out here is this setting is not nearly as grimdark as like 40K or something like that, where it's just pure evil to the max. It's like, no, there was a point where they had all of these same values of honor and taking care of people and industry, all that we had as well. But unfortunately, it also means that the earlier owners of that technology were allowed to dictate a lot of the terms, which is why all these places are so firmly wrapped under imperial control. Now, the two big powers in Europe left to discuss are the Russians, which have had a very different history, but very recognizable to the Russia that we understand. If you are a fan of learning about the fall of the House of the Romanovs, there are a lot of key players that actually transpose from the real life story into this in a way that, if you're a fan of the history, is very comical. They gained a lot of lost territories. It's slow to modernize. It's struggling to bring in Poland and Lithuania, who basically break off and you declare their independence from Mother Russia. So a little bit of nuance there to their history, but the real change here is a faction that we don't really recognize called the Holy Roman Empire. Now, in our history, this area was the Holy Roman Empire until like the 1500s, and then we started changing names. And then it fell apart during the Napoleonic Wars, and then yada yada. This is a big yada yada, capital Y, Germany. Okay, that's basically how it all went down. The parries and the thrusts of these nation borders played out very differently, and Marcher's World Anvil does a great job of accounting the details of it if you are a history buff. The short of it is that a rebel government amongst the French was about to roll over the Vatican, and the still named Holy Roman Empire had a written agreement to aid them if needed. This development saw the deployment of the first ever shield generator around the Vatican, and since then, the Catholic Empire in Rome has been linked to the Holy Roman Empire of Greater Europe, inextricably. And it creates a whole new web of connections, agreements, and obligations between these nation-states and pillars of authority than we had in our own history, but it just doesn't seem that outlandish. So with the funding and the authority of the Catholic Church, essentially the Holy Roman Empire just solidified, calcified, and then got reinvested in. So that's how it was brought forward into the current timeline. Now, the last faction I want to talk about and really introduce is probably my favorite model line from the guys at Marcher, and that is the Empire of Japan. Now, just like in our world, they developed largely the same until the 1700s. They even went into relative isolation until Commodore Matthew Perry was like, nah, you're going to open for business. I believe it was him. And just like in our world, the nation rallied and unified, correctly observing that nations are being gobbled up into empires. This is a predator and prey world, and we need to move from one category to the other, just like they did in our world. The difference in Marcher, however, is twofold, right? The technological level that they entered into during the Meiji Restoration is at a different level. So if you're not familiar with the real world history, the Meiji Restoration is basically a time where Japan's government opened its coffers and was like, we need to modernize. I am grossly oversimplifying here, but they sent observers out to all the different major nations, figured out how other armies and cultures and stuff did things, and brought the best ideas and tried to reform Japan to make them seem like a world power that couldn't just be a colony to someone else. That's the elevator pitch for it. What we're simply saying in Marcher, though, is that the technological level that they had to figure out was simply 150 years further ahead. And they did it the same. So it's like a great accomplishment. I don't know, I love it. All of a sudden, Japan is able to incorporate new technologies, energy fields, that kind of stuff, and really bring them into the army in new and fresh ways that other forces didn't have access to. You know, basically taking tactics and stuff like that from their history, Japan's history, and then bringing those into the technological tree. So it's a different kind of Japan. They have kind of the same arc in general up until this point. It's just that the technological level they aspire to is much greater and they nail it. And the other thing that matters quite a bit when it comes to this section of the world and its overall history is that in the Marcher universe, racism did not blind people the same way that it did in ours. By that I mean we have people in our world who made real military decisions and thought, oh, the Japanese couldn't they couldn't beat us. They're worse than us. Why? Because they're Japanese. And that idiocy made very real military mistakes. And what I'm saying is that in the March universe, when the Empire of Japan, right, went out, sent the observers, and basically leveled up their society tree tenfold in a very short amount of time, all the powers were like, wait a minute. And kind of like acknowledged the threat. Not threat as in the Japanese were evil, but like, this is a new major player and we're going to give them space. They did still have a Russo-Japanese war and it ended the exact same way. And so that was more of like a confirmation. Whereas in our world, that was sometimes seen as a fluke. And Golden Dragon Games did a great job of using this faction as a canvas to really detail what it looks like for an old world to meet this one. And so this forms our pantheon, if you will, of major powers. And one thing that's difficult to articulate here, but I feel like they do a good job in writing the articles on World Anvil, is that the same world agreements and ties between nations, the rate and location of territory changes are different, but the things that keep the world kind of running as it was pre-World War I, all those big agreements, Bismarckian diplomacy and all that kind of stuff, they're still locked in place. The only major actions that have precipitated the world war that everyone is just now churning into is by things like rebellions, insurgencies, assassins. But that all changes in the year 1938. This is their moment in history. This is the dual assassination of Napoleon V in France and Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, the Archduke was the event that brought us into World War I, or not us as in the United States, but the world into World War I. But having a new French Republic emperor assassinated is another way to bring a new level of fresh hell into that entirely. This was done by a few communist mobs in France, and there is an immediate response. The Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire declares war on this revolutionary government. And just like in our own world, where the deaths of a very a small handful of important people began a series of dominoes that led to terrible events, that's what's happening here. And almost like a vortex, all the major powers are being pulled into it because of that alliance system. Again, the players have changed on our board, but the reason that they were still there and recognizable is because they've just been locked into these agreements. We disregarded ours in World War I. This is, or I should say we burned away those agreements in World War I. This is when we're going to start doing that in this universe. And immediately all the nations begin lashing out at one another with weapons that our forefathers could have never comprehended, because while this is the loose history of nation states, we didn't even really touch on the technological revolution too much. Right, since the Industrial Revolution, our tech progress has been nearly exponential. So what if we had another 150-year head start on it? Right, the Marcher universe has shield generators, energy weapons, gravitic engines to make flight accessible and reliable. The killing power of machines skyrocketed from anything that we could conceivably recognize today. New forms of things that we see as tanks and mechanical walkers, crude batteries, rail weapons, all of that. And because, like in our World War I setting, in the real world, none of those weapons had been tested at full-scale war at each other, because there hadn't been a major European war in about 100 years. This is largely the same. It's just that the killing power of those weapons is exponentially higher. And like I end all my videos, I just want to chat very kind of casually about why is this cool? Why does Marcher appeal to me? I met these folks at Adepticon, and they gave me a great a demo of their game. Found it very engaging. Models are absolutely beautiful. But as far as the lore goes, the blending of real people and fantastical events, I love it because it's not nearly as grimdark as other games. Right? There's a lot of romanticism of the war, kind of like in early stages of World War I, like the propaganda posters and that kind of stuff. But it's optimistic, to say the least. And of course, this story arc, this setting, exists to promote the model line. All the STLs are available for sale, but it's an opportunity to look at the rich tapestry of cultures that exists in our world and imagine them through a different lens. It highlights what's insanely cool about each nation they have represented so far as I think they're going to be adding more later on. But it injects a little bit of diesel punk whimsy without being so oppressively grim that it becomes depressing. It's a world where people have tried in general to use innovation and technology to make the planet a better place, where we have those common old world values similar to what we had before World War I. Not that it didn't have its own fair share of problems, but it was a different kind of pressure. I think it's most present in the Empire of Japan and the Holy Roman Empire. Right? For Japan, I find their history fascinating in general, and the idea that they had to make that same leap from, their own history to kind of fitting into a modern world at an accelerated pace only gets cooler the greater the gulf between then and now. And as far as the Holy Roman Empire, because it shows a form of German history where militarism wasn't the defining characteristic. Right, a lot of the media and stuff like that will paint World War I Germany as militarism. They had a lot of the Austro-Hungarian, Prussian elements in their forces. When in this world, it almost seems like an old government that got a fresh breath of fresh air at some point by allying themselves with the Vatican. And now it finds itself kind of stuck between an antagonistic enemy in the new French Republic and its obligations to its governments that are trying to keep everything in balance until it all just falls apart. There's a lot of little pebbles that kind of had to roll downhill the right way to make World War I and II happen the way they did in our world, and it's no different here. There really are several articles regarding the history of the Marcher universe, how things developed they did and why, and all of it comes together to form a very unique universe with a cool aesthetic and a lot of fun to be explored. If you've been following along with my Marcher content, I just finished painting up my Alaskan Defense Force. These are U.S. Americans stationed up in Anchorage, Alaska. I got some walkers, some battle walkers, what they're called. A couple of infantry and engineers. I absolutely adore them. And they got to be ready because the Russian Empire is coming over through Alaska. That's my story. If there's something about this universe that sounds appealing to you, please let me know in the comments down below. If you have anything to add, I always pin the most helpful comments to the top. And I just hope that you'll take some time and check out Marcher by Golden Dragon Games. It is very cool, and I highly recommend it. Thank you so much for listening, and happy wargaming.